that you started, I think, when I became a postdoc. So I don't think it was happening.
2011, 2012, yeah.
I was a postdoc in a lab at Cornell, and my postdoc advisor walks in and says, "What did your PhD boss do?" And I found out that Paul was a center article in Science talking about the work of whistleblowing in scientific literature and why that's important and standing up for not just letting things slide. So I hope today you guys get a little bit of that message out as well. Paul will be sticking around a little after as well if you want to talk about, heart, cardiology, mitochondria, research type stuff. I know I got all of my researchers in there talking about what you're doing. It's not just turnips, right, anymore. So talking to you a little bit about that.
Good. Thanks, Lindsay, for the invitation. I think is this the third time I've been, second time? I can't remember. Yeah, it's always good to catch up with Dr. B. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about, here we go. There we go. So a little bit of an introduction, first of all, about what do we mean when we say scientific misconduct. More importantly, really, how does the federal government define that? That's what really matters here. Then talk about some examples, and in particular, this issue of image manipulation in the literature, in scientific papers. You'll see some examples of that. Plagiarism, self-plagiarism, those types of things. Then a fairly good discussion of all the various different advances that have gone on over the past decade in watchdogs and how we actually detect this stuff. How big is the problem? What are the consequences? And then finally, at the end, I'm going to talk about some of my own experiences in this field. So, what is scientific misconduct? It's actually a fairly simple definition. The federal policy, there is a federal agency called the Office of Research Integrity, or the ORI, and they define misconduct as fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in the proposing, performing, reviewing, or reporting of research. So we tend to think about this as happening, how do we find misconduct? Oh, somebody will publish a paper and we find there's manipulated data in a paper, right? Look at these last four words. This is important. You can get in trouble for faking data in a grant proposal. You don't actually have to do the research. You don't have to get funded. You don't have to publish anything. Right? A grant proposal is a letter to the government that says, give me money, right? If you fake data in a grant proposal, you are trying to obtain money from the government by illicit purposes. The federal government defines that as mail fraud, right? You're writing a letter to the government. You're abusing the postal system to get money out of the government. That is mail fraud. That is a felony offense, okay? So these are fairly serious charges. One important thing, this is all defined in a Code of Federal Regulations document. It's 42 CFR Part 93. The ORI right now is rewriting the rules and the guidelines and seeking clarity in some of the language. You can go to regulations.gov and you can comment on this. If you want input on how these rules are made, you can help put towards that process. So what are these three pillars of misconduct? What do we mean? How do we define this? So fabrication, pretty simple, making up data. Falsification is a little bit more nuanced. It means manipulating things such that the research record is misrepresented. This is really important in the federal guidelines. Basically what it means is doing one thing and then reporting something else, right? Manipulating so for example, getting a result from a piece of equipment, you don't like the number, so putting a different number down in your lab book, right? That number in the lab book, the research record doesn't represent what was said by the experiment. And then plagiarism, it should be fairly obvious that, you should all be familiar with plagiarism policies at any university. And then what is the bar? Where do we set the bar that actually says, what is this misconduct? Was this an accidental mistake? This kind of thing. So basically, there are three key concepts that come into this. One is we need context. So in order to be misconduct, it has to be a departure from the accepted practices. And there is a recognition in all the policies that every scientific field has its own standards regarding what's acceptable. Quite importantly, there are big differences geographically, culturally, in what is considered misconduct, right? So the question really here with context is, did the person know better? Should they have known better? That's a key concept there. It has to be done intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly, right? We don't want to punish people for making innocent mistakes, right? So this is one that's really tough to assign, right? How do you assign intent? How do you prove that somebody did something deliberately? That's really difficult to prove. And then evidence, right? What about the evidence? How much evidence is there? And so, for example, context, not following the practices in the field. Have the rules changed recently, right? This is a big problem. What was acceptable 20 years ago is no longer acceptable, right? The rules for what is required in terms of data stewardship are changing as we speak. Training, should they have known better? Hopefully by the end of today, you all should have known better, right? The intent, how much manipulation is there to get a result? So let's say we had, say, 2 images, and the image was copied from one paper to another. Maybe that happened accidentally. But if the image was copied from one paper to another, and it was rotated, and it was cropped, and the color got changed, that's 3 steps. That requires 3 separate decision points. That's intentional, right? So the more manipulations that take place to the data, that allows us to sort of make statements regarding the intent of the individual when they were doing this. What do they stand to gain, right? Is this multi-million-dollar research that supports a biotech company, as you'll see later on? Is there something for which, if this person doesn't get this paper, they're going to get fired? Are the stakes high? Can it be written off as a mistake, as laziness or sloppiness? Is it an isolated case? One paper, one mistake. Maybe it's a mistake. You'll see there are individuals who have 30, 40, 50 papers under question, right? That's a lot of mistakes, right? Wink, wink. We look at the volume of evidence, right? Some people in the literature make a lot of mistakes, and it's not funny. And then the evidence. Let's look at some examples. So this is one of my sort of scientific heroes. This is Helene Hill from New Jersey. She wrote a book on this, actually. So one of the things where she discovered misconduct, she applied something which is called terminal digit analysis. Okay. So the way this works is if we have a completely random set of thousands of numbers, if those numbers originated from a stochastic process, like densitometry measurements, or in this case, actually, it was cell counts using a Coulter counter, the last digit on the right-hand side of those numbers will be randomly distributed between 0 and 9. There is just as much chance of a 0 appearing as there is a 1, 2, 3, or a 4, right? Now, let's say I'm making up a data set. How am I going to do that? I'm going to type in. I have muscle memory. I'm going to accidentally hit the number 7 more than by chance, or the number 9, or whatever, right? When I'm told to generate a set of random numbers, like all humans, I'm actually incapable of generating a purely random set of numbers, right? And so when people make up data, we end up with very odd distributions of terminal digits, okay? And in this case, this individual ended up writing a whole book all about the expected distribution and then the actual distribution in this individual's data. And this led to the whole misconduct investigation for this individual. So, there are tools that we can use that are really quite simple, right? You open a spreadsheet and look at a bunch of numbers, and you can tell if it's fake by applying these type of forensic analyses to it. Another example, who's familiar with Western blotting? Everybody has heard of a Western blot, or you know what you're looking at, right? We're We're quantifying the amount of protein, and so we end up with images that look like this, where we have bands, and the density of the band is equal to the amount of protein in the sample. And in this particular example, for these two bands right here that originated from different animals, you can see, first of all, there's a bit of a telltale sign, which is there's a little nick along the bottom edge here, right? If this was just copied and pasted out of a pure Western blot image before putting into a paper, you wouldn't expect to see that little imperfection along the bottom. And in fact, it turns out that this is actually this. It's just the same band. It's been copied and pasted. And so somebody has cloned a section of an image and used it in another part of an image. This is fairly common. It's quite common in the literature to see this. It's not kosher. It's absolutely 100% falls into the definition of fabrication of original research data. So the key reference sphere, it's pretty old, but it stood the test of time. There is a paper in the Journal of Cell Biology. There's called the JCB Guidelines. And the JCB Guidelines basically have said for 15 or 20 years, splicing together of Western blots and other images is completely unacceptable, okay? You will find older literature where it happened 20, 30 years ago. It's been unacceptable for a couple of decades now, okay? This is not okay. You have to indicate the splicing seams. One of the things that has come about, this is a direct quote from this Journal of Cell Biology guideline: do not add or remove or alter images or components of images such that the scientific data is changed. I added an important thing here. All becomes questionable. So the problem, let me ask you a question here. Has that Western blot in the bottom row been spliced together? You can't tell. Why? Because it's been faded out in such a way that instead of being a nice pixelated background noise like these bands here, these are black bands on a pure white background. Even if those two bands were joined together, there'd be no way of telling, because putting a white box next to a white box, you get a white box, right? And so the data has been manipulated in such a way that it's actually impossible to tell. And the language that we use to describe this is there is nothing to anchor the bands to. There's nothing in the background of the image to anchor the features of the image to the pixelation and the noise, right? And the problem is when you see this type of Western blot in a figure in a paper, it's impossible to tell if it's been manipulated. And so the only solution to this is to demand all of the original data from the investigator, right? If you don't want people coming knocking on your door asking for all of the original data from your lab, don't do this to your Western blots to make people suspicious, right? So there's a lot of a pathway here. It's not just about don't fiddle with the data to change the data. Don't fiddle with the data in a way that makes people suspicious of what you're doing, right? Here's another example. Can anybody see where these are the same image? Right? These are two different treatment groups of cells. That's been cloned, right? So there's actually only one image here, and they've just moved the image slightly and cropped different sections of the image and said that it's the same thing. This is another example. Anybody guess which two images are the same? Yeah? Yep, the first two on the left-hand side, they're actually horizontal flip, right? They've just flipped the image and made it look like it's something else, right? Very, very common occurrence. This one's my favorite, okay? Anybody find anything similar in these images, okay? Here you go. Everything in the same color box is a clone. Everything in the same color box. The blue is the blue. The red is the red, the pink is the pink. The green here has been rotated. The yellow has been flipped upside down, okay? My pet theory is this is just one image and they just spliced it up to make, right? This is the definition of fabrication, right? It's taking something and making data out of nothing, right? By the way, for this particular image, it took 6 years from the notification of the journal to them retracting this paper, okay? And this is another big problem in the field, is that when this kind of stuff gets reported to journals and to universities, nothing happens. They don't do anything about it, right? So this gets to this problem of just because it's published in a paper, in a journal, it's not a done deal, it's not gospel, it's not 100% believable. And even papers that have had known reporting of fraudulent data sit there in the literature and continue to get cited for another decade before they finally get retracted, right? So this is a big issue in the field. This one's fun. This is from a Brazilian group. This is a Western blot. These are 10 papers with 15 separate examples. We can actually look and line all of these up and move a few things around and then look at them all under the same circumstances. This guy basically had a lucky Western blot and put it in all his papers, right? It's pretty crazy. Thankfully now, actually, it took a while, but all 10 of these papers have been retracted, right, for scientific fraud. So it's fairly common, as you see. These things are, once you've seen it, you can't unsee it, right? It's actually fun. If you have a kind of an eye for pattern recognition, this is actually a fun process to get involved in. So that's sort of fabrication, falsification. What about plagiarism? So plagiarism, passing off your ideas or the words of another without credit. Lots of examples of this, you know, taking things out of Wikipedia. It's quite common for individuals who come from other countries to maybe have published a paper in a different language in their home country and then move to a different country and publish the same work in a different language, right? Just shove it through Google Translate, whatever. Reusing your own materials. That's really what's called self-plagiarism. Obviously, you know, we don't have a lot of time to go into it, but there's a lot of discussion going on right now regarding GPT and AI and other text large language models. You know, that I think would fall under the general definition of plagiarism in terms of the fact that it's not original scholarship, it's not an idea that's coming out of your head, right? In fact, there was one very good recent example. A paper was flagged because it contains some text and the words regenerate response, and then some more text. And anybody who's ever used GPT knows that if you don't like the answer that it gives you, there's a little button there that says regenerate response. And so they copied and they forgot to remove that from the text, right? And it made its way into the paper, and so now we know that paper. So in fact, that's a fairly easy thing that people are doing now. They're looking for the words regenerate response in papers. And if you find it, it means that paper has AI content, that somebody was too lazy to remove those two little words. This is another example of that. This is in computing science. They found what would be called tortured phrases. So these are phrases where text has been put through a thesaurus or something translation-y in order to make it sound different from the original. And in computing science, you end up with these really weird things, you know. So instead of big data, we end up with huge information, right? And instead of high performance computing, we get elite figuring, right? And so these people basically found all these tortured phrases and then just did massive searches through the computer science literature and identified thousands of papers where clearly the writing and the content of these papers has just been fudged through various translation engines in order to make it not look directly plagiarized, right? So when people say, hey, I want to write something like this, take a block of text, translate it, or use the thesaurus function in Microsoft Word, and they end up coming up with all kind of weird things like this. Very easy to find now. Another example, these are two papers that were published quite a while ago. Everything in yellow is the same. Lots of things that can be used to detect plagiarism. Much of the text is verbatim. The structure and the organization is the same. 21 of the 36 references are actually the same in this example. And there are no common authors, right? They just took it out of the literature. There are some exceptions to plagiarism rules. Generally, for theses, PhD theses, master's theses, that kind of thing, it's quite common to include previously published work in the body of the thesis with acknowledgement. The methods section of a paper, right, there's only so many ways that you can write, we killed a mouse and took the brain out. You can't really say that many different ways. So method sections very often will contain overlapping text. That's quite common. And then the thing that is weird, to me at least, is the Office of Research Integrity says that self-plagiarism is not misconduct. Publishing the same thing twice is not misconduct. And the reason why is because the research record has still been accurately represented. Right? That to me is a bit of a shock when I learned that, right? So in fact, this issue of self-plagiarism causes a number of issues. What you're basically doing is publishing the same thing twice. And what that does is it allows the individual to game the metrics by which we're all judged, right? Faculty, postdocs, researchers, we're judged on how many papers we publish. Well, if you can publish 2 sets of papers with only doing 1 set of experiments, you've got a bigger CV. You're going to get promoted. You're going to get grants, all these other kind of things, right? It's double dipping, as George Costanza in Seinfeld engaged in, right? It enables you to get extra credit with no extra work, right? So it's the federal government doesn't define it as misconduct, but it's ethically kind of icky, right? It falls into that questionable practices example. These are more examples of self-plagiarism. This is another example. These are 2 figures from a paper. They were submitted a week apart. The one on the left was submitted first, but the one on the right was published first. This actually intersects quite a lot with copyright issues and infringement, because when you publish a paper, you typically assign copyright to the journal for those figures. So in this case, who owns the copyright? And it is possible, I've yet to see an example of this, but it is possible that in fact the publisher of one journal could go after the other journal for copyright infringement, for reusing their copyrighted image, right? And the authors here essentially lied by assigning copyright to both journals, which they're not allowed to do. This is another example. This is the example, actually, I reported this to the Office of Research Integrity. And that sentence there, that is from an email that the ORI sent to me that basically said, yeah, that's not misconduct. I mean, to me, that's misconduct. That's taking the exact same data and publishing it again 4 years later. Tweaking around a little bit with the images. It's the same data being used twice for extra credit, right? It is important to know that you will get caught. There are lots and lots of plagiarism checking software around. It's quite simple to just take a piece of text from an essay or whatever and shove it into Google and find out if it's ever been published anywhere else. Lots of universities have subscriptions to all these various authentication engines and plagiarism detection engines. And then there are lots of watchdogs and lots of people around doing this. This is one example. This lady, Deborah Weberwolf, she's a German living in the US. She runs a blog. Basically what she has found is plagiarism in the PhD theses of European politicians. So it turns out if you're in a country like Germany and you want to be involved in politics, you have to have a doctorate. Well, who has time to write a PhD, right? Just plagiarize something. And she has found massive amounts of ghostwriting and plagiarism within the PhD theses published of many prominent European politicians, including, I should note, Ursula von der Leyen, who's the head of the EU. Okay? This is having a rather large impact on European politics at this time. Many of you have probably heard of Elizabeth Bick. Elizabeth Bick used to work for a biotech company, noted some fraudulent activity going on there, and basically quit her job to go looking at fraud all day. And she now runs essentially an independent consultancy looking for and flagging papers. She has a very good Twitter account where she posts examples of image manipulation and duplication all the time. She runs a really wonderful blog, Science Integrity Digest, where she talks about this stuff. Quite a good, very prolific watchdog. Leo Schneider is another example. He's another German guy. Yeah, trigger language, trigger warning here. This guy swears a lot, kind of like me, and you know he's a little bit racist here and there when he's talking about misconduct from certain parts of the world and the people that live there. But you know, you don't want to be featured on this guy's blog. Right. These are people that are writing about and talking about fraud all the time. You do not want to be on this guy's website on a Friday afternoon, right? You don't want to be having your colleagues send an email to you saying, hey, yeah, I saw you guys on For Better Science. Yeah, what's that all about? This will trash your career if you're a scientist. This is another example, Data Colada. They wrote a number of articles all about the misconduct in the reporting of Francesca Gino. She is a professor at Harvard Business School. She decided to sue them for defamation, right? She filed a defamation lawsuit against them, okay? They launched a GoFundMe. It's already at $330,000. She is going to lose that lawsuit, basically. She threatened to sue them, not because they're wrong, she threatened to sue them to shut them up, okay? This is a fairly common occurrence in scientific fraud circles. There is a concept known as a SLAP, right? It is a strategic lawsuit against public participation, SLAPP. A SLAP is basically, I don't like what you're saying, I'm going to sue you, shut up, or I will take you to court, right? That person has no intention of suing you. They can't afford to sue you. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to bring a defamation case to court. They're just threatening to sue you to shut you up, right? That is called a SLAP. Luckily, we live in New York where we have fairly good anti-SLAP legislation. So if somebody tries to sue you, you can just point at that legislation and say, go away. Nick Brown, James Heathers, these are other examples. If you like swearing, this guy is Australian, and every other word is the F-bomb. But they basically were behind the reporting of the misconduct by Brian Wansink, who many of you will know of at Cornell. This is the guy who was the senior advisor to the USDA. All of these nutritional studies that led to the creation of recommended daily allowances, this type of thing, all based on completely fake research, fake surveys, all fake. These guys uncovered it. Again, you don't want to appear on these people's blogs, right? These are no longer conversations that are taking place in the quiet halls of academia, right? These are conversations that are taking place wide open on the internet in full view of everybody. This is no longer something that can be hushed up, right? That's a really important concept. There are AI tools now for image replication. This is one that I was involved in developing. Actually, how do you train an AI to look for bad data? You feed it thousands of examples of bad data. What am I sitting on? A database of thousands of examples of bad data, right? So actually the image manipulation database that I've developed, we're collaborating with a number of individuals to try to use that to train AI to look for various different types of image manipulation. There is, even now, it's a little bit odd, we have fake software to look for fake data, right? Proofig is a commercial product. You can buy it. It costs money. You can download it. And it is essentially software that purports to find replicated or problematic images within papers, okay? It was launched by a husband and wife team who actually a decade ago had several of their own papers retracted for misconduct. And they said, oh, as a service to the research community, we got stung by this. So we're going to launch a software product so that other PIs can screen their papers before they submit them to the journal so that they can't risk having their papers retracted at a later date, right? Would you want to buy, I don't know, a bank account protection software from a convicted theft criminal, right? I mean, these are very, very problematic products. By the way, this product doesn't work. There are several examples of people reporting data to journals saying, hey, these figures are fraudulent, and the journal says, no, it's not. We shoved it through Proofig, and it didn't find anything. And you go back and you say, well, yeah, look again, guys. It's fraudulent. And they're like, oh, really? Oh, well, we put it through Proofig. It can't be fraud. You know, Proofig doesn't work. So we've literally jumped the shark. We have fake software for looking for fake data. Another watchdog, PubPeer. This is a website every one of you should be familiar with if you're looking at the scientific data and looking on PubMed. This is basically a website where anybody can go, read a paper, and write a comment on it. This has become a clearinghouse for the reporting of problematic data. The most important thing you can do if you're interacting with the scientific literature is to install the browser plugin. They have a browser plugin for PubPeer. Operates with all the major browser platforms. That way, you're reading a website, you're reading a paper, you're reading any type of scientific literature, and if there's a reference in there to a paper that has been flagged on PubPeer, it'll show up in the top corner of the browser, and it will alert you, hey, this paper, by the way, has some problems with it, right? That's a really good tool for knowing if what you're reading is good or has problems. So how big of a problem is this? Well, you know, this is a bit of an old study from Dan Finelli, basically saying that around 2% of scientists admit to having done this. 30% of scientists admit to what are called questionable research practices. Of course, there's a big problem with this because the data is self-reported. How many people here have engaged in research fraud? No, I didn't think so, right? Would you raise your hand even if you had, right? It's not something people admit to, right? Who's doing the survey? Is my boss going to find out, right? So these numbers are vast underestimates of the actual frequency of this, right? This was another example. This was from the University of Oslo a few years ago, and they found a similar number of about 1.4%. What's interesting is that 13% of people knew somebody else who had. Isn't that interesting? This paper is quite interesting. It was a pair of papers, because they actually did things the other way around. The first thing they did is said, have you ever committed questionable research practices, right? And they came up with various numbers, and you know, in this case, actually, it was closer to 5%, still pretty low. But then they flipped the question on its head, and they said, how many of you engage in responsible research practices? Like keeping comprehensive records, right? Like pre-registration, like making all the underlying data available. So in fact, if you flip this question on its head and say, are people doing the right thing? It's clear that there's obviously a much bigger proportion of people doing the wrong thing, right? So it depends how you ask the question. What is the frequency? This is from a paper by Elizabeth Bick. Basically what she did, along with these other people, is they looked at 20,000 papers across 40 journals, 20 years. They found 4% had problematic figures, and 2% of those were suggestive of deliberate manipulation. There was a nice little correlation with impact factor, but it wasn't very much. So this is the origin of the phrase, just because it's in Nature doesn't mean it's bullshit, right? And then there was some countries over or underrepresented geographically. This is a very contentious slide, but it does appear that papers with misconduct do originate from certain parts of the globe more than others. This is a very, very recent study, just published as a preprint this year. Sholto, David here, he looked at 1,500 articles. 700 of those articles contain images. 115 of those contained inappropriate duplications. 16% of the papers with images had image problems, right? Inappropriate duplication. That's a big number. And that's just in one journal, right? There is another problem. Many of you may have heard of something called a paper mill. A paper mill is, in a lot of countries, people need to publish in order to get promoted, but they don't have time to write papers. So they basically buy authorship on a paper. And there are lots of websites where you can go and they'll say, hey, we have a paper lined up, ready to publish. Slot number 3 is available for $2,000. And you can buy authorship on a paper. And the data in these papers is frequently fake data as well, okay? So these things are called paper mills. Quite importantly, recognize this is a spreadsheet of spreadsheets. Every single one of these links takes you to another spreadsheet with dozens or hundreds or thousands of examples of papers that are paper mill papers, right? And so people are digging into these networks and understanding, right? And by the way, this is just from A down to N. There's all the way down to Z as well. This is about half of the spreadsheet of spreadsheets, right? Hundreds of thousands of fake papers in the literature, all because people are just too lazy to do the actual science and they just want to buy something that's computer generated or randomly AI generated or pasted and copied together so they can get their name on a paper to get promoted to get on with their job, right? Big problem with the whole publish to survive mechanism we have in academia. How good are we at detecting this? Well, turns out only about 0.02% of published papers are ever retracted due to misconduct. But 2% of scientists admit to misconduct. So yeah, we're finding about 1% of what's out there, basically. We suck at finding misconduct. About 1%, not a very good detection rate. How much does it cost? This was a paper where they looked at various different metrics. They basically said, and by the way, this was 2014, so a decade ago, $400,000 per retracted paper. And that's just for a 1% detection rate, okay? This is an enormous amount of money, okay? This is money that is being wasted. These are public tax dollars. This is NIH money, right? This is money that if it had been given to scientists actually doing the right thing, could maybe be better spent, right? This is a big waste. What's the worst that could happen? There are consequences. You can have an erratum, you can have a correction, people will look at your other work. You get one paper flagged on PubPeer, the mob will pile on and look at all your other papers for images and errors. And pretty soon you're up to 20, 30 papers on PubPeer and someone's going to email your department chair and you're out of a job, right? If you do this in a grant application, no more grants for you. Withdrawal, you can get banned from applying to grants. Bad publicity. In this case, this was a guy, Faisal Sarkar. He was moving from Michigan to the University of Mississippi, and he secured a job, a faculty offer. But then 75 of his papers showed up on PubPeer with problems. Somebody emailed the chair at Mississippi, and they withdrew the job application. Right? He sued Mississippi. He sued his existing institution in Michigan because he thought somebody was a whistleblower there. He sued PubPeer. He lost everything. He ended up emigrating and retiring, skulking off. right? Big, big, big problem. This guy ended up in prison for faking data in HIV research. Another big consequence is public health. Obviously, you probably heard of a guy called Andrew Wakefield. He's the person that essentially started this entire bullshit field of an association between vaccination and autism. And as a result, of course, everything was fake. Everything was fake. And now we have reemergence of diseases like measles because people aren't getting vaccinated against simple, preventable diseases, right? This is having big issues for public health. It gets out into the mainstream media. This is no longer something that is discussed in Science Magazine or Scientific American or venues like that. This is showing up in the New York Times, the Washington Post, all the major newspapers, CNN, are getting hold of this idea that scientific fraud is a big problem. This creates big issues for scientists, all of us. This is Chuck Grassley. He's a senator from Iowa. And he's basically calling to cut the NIH budget. Why should we be pouring $30 billion a year at the NIH if they're just faking all the data, right? The rest of us can't have nice things because a few people decide to fake the data, right? This is not good for all of science, right? We don't need congressional representatives and senators thinking that we as scientists can't police our own house and keep it real, right? That's a big issue. This is one example that I was just talking about before we started. This is Cassava. They're a scientific company that had a $2 billion market cap. This was the #1 traded stock by volume on the NASDAQ in 2021. They have patients in phase 2 clinical trials right now. It is 100% founded on complete garbage science. Okay, there's a brand new article. Go to Science Magazine, search for Cassava. There is a brand new article today in Science all about this case of fraud. Okay. Other consequences. The NIH is sitting up and taking notice about this. They're saying, hey, why are we pouring all this money into science if people are just faking the data? So now there are lots of new rules ever since 2016, all about authentication, data stewardship, pre-registration, randomization, blinding, all of the things that we need to do in order to stop this type of data manipulation from happening. And then that really gets into this conversation. How do we minimize misconduct? Well, we have to train, right? We have to start early. We need good research practices like blinding experiments, like pre-registration, right? Rather than we do an experiment to see what happens. Oh, that looks interesting. Let's do another one of those, right? Confirmation bias, those types of things, right? P-hacking, right? Oh, we've got a result. It's almost significant. Let's just do a couple more N's and see if we can make it significant, right? Lots of labs engage in that. Having robust and open lab data records, Dr. Burwell will confirm this, right? Everything in my lab is stored on a shared lab drive. We've had the same cloud server for 20 years. Every experiment, including all of your original experiments, are still available on the shared lab drive, and everybody in the lab has access to that drive, right? It's not a case of everybody keeping their data on their own laptop and not sharing it with anybody, right? That's how you get misconduct, right? When only one person can get the experiment to work and won't share their secret magic pixie dust with anybody else in the lab, right? People being secretive, taking their lab books home at night, right? That's the kind of thing we need to watch out for. And reporting. This is something we're not very good at, frankly, is making it easy to report this, right? You have research going on at this university. Do you have a research integrity officer? Do you have a research integrity office? Who do I report research integrity issues to if I discover misconduct? Probably Dr. Burwell here, right? Right? But right? How do we make it transparent, right? Do we have an integrity hotline so that if I'm standing alongside somebody and I see them, pipetting something under the bench, and right? How do I report that? Right? We need open structures to make it easy to report this stuff without ramifications, without consequences, right? Without retaliation. How do we enforce it? How do we investigate it? How do we make it known? You would be amazed at the number of cases where these things get investigated and then the results get quietly brushed under the carpet, right? And we never really find out what happened. We just find out, several years later that somebody quietly retired or left. And, oh yeah, there was misconduct, but we can't say anything about it, right? We're very bad at not broadcasting what actually happened in these cases. And something we absolutely suck at is rewarding good science, right? We're not very good at rewarding good science. So how do you blow the whistle? How do you do this? Well, Theodore Roosevelt said it best, really. Speak quietly and carry a big stick. And so, really the kind of thing you need to do here is to be informal, you need to be educational, you need to be non-adversarial. So, it's not walking up to your lab mate and saying, hey, I think you faked those data, right? That's not going to get you very far, right? Hey, I noticed like 2 of the values in your lab book are like really similar. That's kind of coincidental. Can you explain that to me? What's going on there, right? Just sort of casual, question without accusing, right? That's really the key here for trying to get this to work. Anonymity is not guaranteed. We're going to talk about that in a second. Be prepared for blowback. The university may do its very best to try to protect you against your identity being revealed, but that will never be guaranteed. And if a big shot finds out that you, little lowly graduate student, accused them of fraud, they're going to be pissed, right? They're going to come down on you and make your life very difficult because they can, right? Oftentimes, a lot of the people that are being accused of this type of misconduct are incredibly rich and incredibly high up in the university hierarchy, right? And that makes it pretty difficult to do if you're just a lowly little grad student or postdoc trying to make accusations. And so, lastly, I want to just spend a couple of minutes talking about some of the adventures I've had in this area. So the sort of timeline here, in about 2009, I think this was right after you'd left the lab, we started noticing some oddities in some mitochondrial potassium channel papers. And then in 2011, I found some similar oddities in a grant application to the American Heart Association by the author of one of these papers, actually. So this got reported to the American Heart Association, got reported to the Office of Research Integrity. Then in 2012, we came along, and with a couple of other different bloggers, I started reporting on a bunch of misconduct in the lab of a guy from MD Anderson Cancer Center, a guy called Bharat Agarwal, okay? Just as like an indicator of the kind of flags that show up when we're looking at individuals that are engaging in this type of practice, okay? This guy has 650 papers, okay? I've been in science for 20 years and I've only got about 140 papers, okay? This guy has 650 papers. At a certain point in 2012, 2013, this guy was publishing 45 papers a year. That's almost one a week. How in the hell do you have any kind of quality control when your lab is churning out a paper a week, right? That is a red flag for that person has lost control of what is going on in their lab. They have no idea what the primary data looks like, right? No human individual can oversee that volume of research reasonably well, right? So then eventually I decided to start my own blog. I started sciencefraud.org. The name of the site was somewhat unfortunate. It turns out that being featured on a site called Science Fraud is not something that people like. Their name being associated with that. So I reported on about 275 papers by 60 different groups. 6 different authors then came along and basically tried to sue me. Okay, so all of these individuals launched a lawsuit against me and essentially tried to sue me. None of them succeeded. All of them have essentially been fired or emigrated or died. And so, the bottom line is, I was right, I've been vindicated, right? But unfortunately, at the time, I was a junior investigator. I didn't have tenure. My university recommended that I should just shut down this website because it posed a big legal threat, and that's basically what I did. So I closed the site, I lawyered up, I had to basically pay for a lawyer out of my own pocket to quash these lawsuits. And as we said, it costs about $100 to get a lawyer to write a letter saying, shut up or I will sue you. It costs about $100,000 to bring a lawsuit to court. And so when you point that out to these individuals, they scuttle off into the distance, right? Ever since then, I continue posting on the lab website and on PubPeer. I probably post 100, 150 papers a year on PubPeer and blog about it. I've actually had a couple more lawsuits since then, and they're fairly easy to deal with. This basically comes with the territory, right? If you are accusing people of fraud, you will be subject to lawsuit threats, right? The important thing is knowing how to handle that, knowing what is an appropriate response to a lawsuit threat, right? Bottom line, the ultimate defense against the charge of defamation, right? You are defaming my character by saying I am fraudulent, right? The ultimate defense. Here's the data. Show me what I wrote that was not true. And then they run away because it's actually true that there is fraud going on. This is something that came out of that, in fact. Turns out that while I was doing all of that work, I had about 275 papers that were blogged about. And then I had a pipeline. When I shut the site down, I had a pipeline of papers which had all undergone the exact same analysis, but I just hadn't bothered, I hadn't actually got around to publishing them on the website yet. But they'd all been through the exact same process. They'd all been reported to the journals, reported to the editors, reported to the universities. And so it turns out that, in fact, for the papers that got blogged about 20% of them got corrected or retracted or had an erratum published. And that's about 7-fold more than private papers, right? These two sets of papers are basically the same, but the ones that were featured on a public-facing internet blog site got more corrective action, right? And it turns out even, almost a decade later, that number is still 4-fold higher, okay? Sunshine is the best form of bleach, right? This is how we correct the scientific literature, right? We write about it, we talk about it in public, and if we publicize the fact that these papers are problematic on websites like PubPeer, there's way bigger chance that something is going to be done about it, right? Universities hate this stuff, right? Every time you write to a university, hey, I've written a blog article about one of your professors claiming fraud in their papers. You shouldn't have done that. You should have just approached them privately first before you went public with your accusations. Well, yeah, see where that gets you, right? It doesn't work. Journals don't want to deal with this. Universities don't want to deal with this. The only way to deal with this is to go public and make your complaints public. Now, if you do that, anonymity becomes an issue, right? So this is the particular example from the American Heart Association grant. These are two separate figures in which hearts were treated with very, very different treatments. And in fact, these are two Western blots, and anybody who's got a set of eyes can see that this is actually the same Western blot. It's just been flipped horizontally, okay? So I wrote this up and sent it to the Federal Office of Research Integrity. And then I got this letter back. Thank you very much. We've concluded that they engaged in research misconduct. He's now left my lab, and we're trying to repeat the experiments to correct the scientific record, okay? This letter came from the PI of the scientist in question, okay? So this grant was a grant that was a postdoc award. Of course, my immediate response, how the hell did you find my name? I reported this to the Office of Research Integrity. Very, very important point. When you report things to the Office of Research Integrity, if you want anonymity, you have to request it. Otherwise, they'll just forward your stuff to whoever the accused is. So I wrote this long screed about how I thought this guy was engaging in fraud, and here's all the evidence, and they just sent it straight to the university. Thanks, right? So in fact, in this case, at the time, I was a very junior PI. This PI here sat on the NIH review panel that was reviewing my grants, right? How's he going to look at my grants now that he knows I accused somebody in his lab of misconduct, right? So this is where this gets a little bit difficult, right? You can request anonymity, and if you really want anonymity, you have to request it, right? The university, if you report stuff to a university, the university lawyers will say, well, we'll do our very best to protect you, but we can't guarantee it. Assume at some point your name will come out in whatever materials, right? Especially, it's less of an issue here, you're a private college, same in Rochester. If you're a state school, everything can be discovered by Freedom of Information requests, FOIA. So if your name is in there mixed in with a bunch of materials regarding a misconduct investigation, it will get out in public when you're dealing with public universities. Why be anonymous? This is another example. This is something I posted on PubPeer probably a decade ago. These are Western blots that have been faked for various different things. This guy here, John Halossi, absolute colossus in the field of skeletal muscle physiology, reviews my grants, reviewed my papers. He's actually dead now, but yeah, this is what he wrote in response, right? This is what he wrote about me on PubPeer in response to me questioning his data, right? So as I said, be prepared for blowback, right? This is, you know, a senior guy in the field, head of a scientific society, editor-in-chief of a journal, writing something about me, little old junior professor at the time, right? So if you're going to do this stuff, you kind of have to have a thick skin, and you have to be ready for people in senior positions to try to threaten you and write nasty things about you, right? What if I sent a paper to a journal and this guy got it to review? How's that going to go down looking at this, right? So this is the kind of stuff that goes on. It's a little bit upsetting. So, conclusions. Scientific misconduct is rare, but it's still very important to stop it, right? It costs a lot of money, billions of dollars in wasted funds. Detection is becoming much, much easier. A lot of the AI detection tools that I mentioned are very new. They're getting better every day. Of course, AI data faking is getting better every day as well, right? We're in a little bit of an arms race here with AI and AI detection. But you know, it is now way easier to find misconduct. It's way easier to report misconduct. It's way easier to get something done about it. These are no longer conversations that are taking place in secret behind closed doors in academia. They're taking place in the mainstream media. This is getting out into public. If you see something, say something, right? Anonymous is okay, probably advisable if you're in a junior position. And then consider the context and the intent and the degree of the evidence as that. Where is the bar? Is this misconduct, or is this just like an accident, right? Yeah, and then I guess the ultimate, right, is the truth is in the data, right? If you get accused of misconduct, here's my lab books, go, take a look, right? If I get accused of misconduct, here's the password, log into my lab cloud storage drive, all the data's there, knock yourself out, take a look, right? Be open, right? I mean, real scientists, when accused of misconduct, don't hire lawyers to say, hey, you can't write that about me, shut up or I'll sue you, right? That's a red flag that person has something to hide, right? And is very common. And I think that's it. Yeah, I think that's it. I had some other slides, but they were all about graduate school, so maybe we won't talk about that. Yeah, all right. So yeah, I can answer any questions or stick around? Yeah.
While you were doing your blog, did you find that you found more of like plagiarism and those types of issues in certain fields, or was it just in general overall?
Generally, I dealt primarily with the life sciences because that's the literature that I'm familiar with. We did deal with a few papers, particularly in sort of nanotechnology and engineering. That area has a lot of fraud and a lot of issues. And then also, there's been a number of big cases in sort of archaeology, you know, faking pictures, placement of artifacts in archaeological digs, that kind of stuff. But yeah, most of what I've dealt with and is fairly common is all sort of, Western blotting, microscopy images, fluorescent cell images, that kind of stuff. Not a whole lot in the field of physics. There are a number of people looking into this type of stuff in the chemistry literature, faking of NMR traces in terms of identifying different compounds and stuff. But yeah, I mean, the bioscience literature in particular does appear to have a bigger problem with this. The big question, and it is a question that comes from that, is this just because it's easier to find, right? And in fact, it's much easier to fake data in physics and hide the fact that it's faked, because the data is maybe numerical or buried in software and a lot harder to find. So, is the fact that we're finding so much of this in life sciences, is it just an artifact of it's easier to find? Because the primary data is primarily image-based. That's something that I don't think we really have a good handle on at the moment. Yeah.
So I have two. Going off what you said, are there paper mills for physics, sciences, archaeological sciences?
There are paper mills around certainly for engineering. The IEEE, a lot of the IEEE journals, the International Engineering blah journals, those journals have been targeted by paper mills and have had a number of papers. There are a number of really cool tools here. So here we go. What is it? What is it? MathGen. Okay, here you go. All right, go, generate. Here you go, MathGen. There you go, math paper. Right, boom, done. Right. So, math, physics, these papers are all, a large language model, right, can generate text regarding anything, right? There's MathGen, there's LibGen, there's half a dozen of these different generative AI tools that can just pop this stuff up. So yeah, I don't think any particular field of science is immune. The tools that we use to detect this stuff and find it are going to be very different, obviously. So yeah, it is kind of scary.
Dan, we'll save your second question for upstairs. I think we need to wrap it up. But let's thank Paul one last time.
Yeah. Hey. Thanks. Where did my USB stick go? Oh, there it is.